They told me to sleep in the yard, like I was some kind of stray animal they'd taken pity on. Sleep in the yard, Grandma. That's what my son Marcus said when I showed up at his doorstep with my suitcase and my dignity hanging by a thread. Sleep in the yard because there wasn't room inside for me anymore. Because his new wife, Jessica, needed space for her yoga studio. Because the kids were too busy with their devices to notice their grandmother standing there like a piece of furniture nobody wanted. So I did something they never expected. I brought my own bed. You think that sounds crazy? Wait until you hear what happened next. Because what started as the most humiliating moment of my 78 years became the thing that changed everything. Not just for me, but for every person in this story who thought they knew exactly where I belonged. My name is Dorothy, and for most of my life, I've been the woman who made room for everyone else. The woman who smiled when they forgot my birthday, who said yes when they needed a babysitter, who disappeared quietly into the background so others could shine. I spent decades being small, being convenient, being grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. But there comes a moment when even the most patient person reaches their limit. And mine came at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. Standing on the front porch of the house, I helped my son by, listening to him tell me where I wasn't welcome. Let me back up and tell you how I got there. How a woman who once ran the PTA and organized church potlucks and raised 3 children, mostly on her own, ended up homeless at 78. Because it didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, the way most betrayals do. One small compromise at a time, until you wake up one day and realize you've given away so much of yourself, there's barely anything left. It started with Harold's death 3 years ago. Harold was my husband of 52 years. And when the cancer took him, it took more than just him. It took my sense of place in the world. Harold had been the one who handled the finances, who made the big decisions, who dealt with repairmen and insurance companies, and all those things I'd never learned to do, because that's how marriages worked back then. You had your roles, and you stuck to them. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, I found myself alone in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. The mortgage was paid off, thank God, but the property taxes kept climbing, and the furnace needed replacing, and the roof started leaking every time it rained hard. I had Harold's pension and my small Social Security check, but it wasn't enough to keep up with everything that old house demanded. That's when Marcus suggested I sell. Not suggested, really, more like insisted. He came over one Sunday with Jessica and the kids, little Emma and Tyler, and while the children played in the backyard, he sat me down at my own kitchen table and explained how it would be better for everyone if I simplified my life. Better for everyone. Those were his exact words, like my life was some kind of complicated math problem that needed solving, and the solution was for me to disappear quietly into something smaller, something less troublesome for him to manage. I should sell the house, he said, take the money and move into one of those nice senior communities where I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work or any of the responsibilities that came with home ownership, where there would be activities and other people my age and medical care right on site when I needed it. He made it sound like a gift he was giving me. Freedom, he called it. Freedom from all the burdens of independent living. What he didn't say, but what hung in the air like smoke, was that it would also be freedom for him. Freedom from having to worry about his aging mother. Freedom from the guilt of not calling often enough or visiting regularly. Freedom from the possibility that someday I might need more from him than he was prepared to give. Jessica nodded along with everything he said, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, her voice sweet as honey, when she added her own thoughts about how wonderful it would be for me to have built-in companionship and organized activities. She talked about the senior center like it was some kind of luxury resort instead of what it really was, a place where people went to wait quietly for death. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them that this house held 52 years of memories, that Harold had built the deck with his own hands, that I'd planted every flower in the garden and knew exactly which corner of the basement stayed dry during storms. I wanted to explain that moving to some sterile facility surrounded by strangers would feel like dying while I was still breathing. But I looked at their faces, at the way they'd already decided what was best for me, and I heard myself saying, okay, because that's what I'd been trained to do my whole life. Say, okay, make things easier for everyone else. Be the good mother, the cooperative widow, the manageable problem. So I sold the house, sold it to a young couple who walked through my rooms like they were already mentally tearing down walls and ripping up the hardwood floors Harold had refinished twice. I packed up 52 years of life into boxes, kept what would fit in a senior apartment, and donated the rest to charity, including Harold's tools, his books, his favorite chair that still smelled like his aftershave. The Sunset Manor wasn't the worst place I could have ended up. The apartment was clean, if small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room barely big enough for my couch and television. The walls were thin, so I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door talking to her dead husband every night, and Mr. Rodriguez across the hall coughing until all hours. But there were worse places to be. The activities Jessica had been so excited about turned out to be bingo twice a week and a book club that only read romance novels I had no interest in. The other residents were nice enough, but most of them were further along in their decline than I was. They shuffled through the halls in their slippers and housecoats, parked in front of the television in the common room, waiting for their children to visit or call or remember they existed. I tried to make the best of it. I really did. I joined the book club, even though I preferred mysteries to romance. I played bingo, even though I'd never been a gambling woman. I sat in the common room and made small talk about medications and doctor appointments and whose grandchildren had visited recently. But inside, I felt like I was disappearing. Every day, I became a little less like the woman I'd been, and a little more like just another elderly resident counting down the days. I stopped wearing my good jewelry because there was nowhere to go that warranted it. I stopped cooking real meals because the kitchen was so small, and cooking for one felt pointless. I stopped reading the newspaper because what was happening in the world felt increasingly irrelevant to my shrinking life. Marcus called every Sunday at exactly 3 o'clock. He'd ask how I was settling in, if I needed anything, if I was making friends. I'd tell him everything was fine, because that's what he wanted to hear, that his mother was adjusting well to her new circumstances, that she was grateful for his wisdom in helping her make this transition, that she wasn't a burden or a worry. Jessica would sometimes get on the phone to tell me about her yoga classes, or her book club, or the new organic grocery store they'd started shopping at. She'd mention in passing that they were thinking about converting my old sewing room into an office, or that they'd finally gotten around to painting the guest bathroom, and I'd make appropriate noises of interest while feeling each word like a small knife. The guest bathroom. That's what they called it now. Not Grandma's bathroom, or even the downstairs bathroom. The guest bathroom. Because I was no longer a permanent fixture in their lives, just an occasional visitor who might need facilities when she came calling. And I did visit at first. Every few weeks, Marcus would drive over to pick me up for Sunday dinner. I'd sit at their table and watch my grandchildren push food around their plates while staring at their phones. And Jessica would serve meals that were either too healthy or too spicy for my taste. And Marcus would make conversation about his work or the weather or anything except how much smaller I felt in their lives. The children barely looked up when I arrived and seemed relieved when I left. Emma was 12 now, all legs and attitude, more interested in whatever was happening on her social media than in hearing stories about her grandfather or learning about the family history I carried in my head. Tyler was 9, sweet but distracted, always eager to get back to his video games. I brought them presents sometimes, little things I'd found at the gift shop in the manor, or books I thought they might enjoy. The presents would disappear into their rooms, never to be mentioned again. The books remained unopened on their shelves, gathering dust between the latest bestsellers Jessica bought them. Gradually, the Sunday dinners became every other Sunday, then once a month, then only on holidays. Marcus would call with apologies, explanations about soccer games and birthday parties, and school projects that couldn't be rescheduled. Jessica was taking a class. Emma had a sleepover. Tyler had a tournament. Always something more important than an old woman who used to matter. The holidays were the worst. Christmas morning at their house, watching Emma and Tyler tear through expensive presents while I sat in the corner chair, the one that didn't match the rest of the furniture, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. They'd hand me my gifts last, always something practical. Slippers, a sweater, a heating pad, things that said we see you as old, and nothing else. I'd give them the presents I'd spent weeks choosing, saved up for on my fixed income, wrapped carefully with paper I'd bought on sale after the previous Christmas. They'd say, "Thank you" politely, and set them aside to make room for the next expensive gadget or designer outfit. By Easter, I could see the pattern clearly. I'd become the obligation nobody wanted, but everyone felt guilty about ignoring completely. The elderly relative who had to be included, but could be managed with minimal effort and maximum convenience for everyone else. That's when the real trouble started. The furnace in my apartment broke on a Thursday in March. Not just a little hiccup that could wait until morning, but a complete breakdown that left me shivering under 3 blankets while snow piled up outside my window. The maintenance man at Sunset Manor took one look at it and shook his head, like he'd seen this coming for months. "Sorry, Mrs. Henderson," he said, scratching his graying beard. "This old unit's been on its last legs since before you moved in. We're gonna need to order parts, maybe a whole new system. Could take a week, maybe 2. A week without heat in March. In Minnesota, when I asked about a temporary heater, he shrugged and said they'd see what they could do. But the whole building was old, and the electrical couldn't handle much more load. I spent that night wearing my winter coat to bed, listening to Mrs. Patterson next door crying about the cold. The next morning, I called Marcus, not to complain, just to let him know what was happening. Maybe ask if he could help me find a hotel for a few nights, until they got the heat working again. "That's rough, Mom," he said, but I could hear the distraction in his voice, the sound of someone doing 3 other things while pretending to listen. Can't you just use extra blankets? I mean, it's almost spring. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's 20 degrees outside. The apartment is barely 40 degrees inside. I can see my breath. There was a pause. Then, Jessica's voice in the background. Something about soccer practice and dry cleaning. And did he remember to call the landscaper? When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted to that careful patience people use with difficult elderly relatives. Look, Mom, I know it's uncomfortable, but you chose to live there. This is what apartment living is like sometimes. Things break. You deal with it. You can't just expect everyone else to drop everything and fix your problems. Your problems. Like staying warm was some kind of personal failing on my part. I hung up and sat in my cold apartment for a long time, watching my breath form little clouds in the air. That's when I realized something had broken inside me too. Something that couldn't be fixed by ordering new parts or calling a repairman. The heat came back after 5 days. 5 days of sleeping in my clothes, of eating cold sandwiches, because I was too cold to stand in the kitchen long enough to cook anything warm, of watching other residents shuffle past my door, bundled in coats and scarves, like we were camping instead of living in a place we paid good money to call home. But the real cold, the one that had settled in my chest during that phone call with Marcus, that cold never went away. Spring turned to summer, and I started noticing things I'd been too polite to see before. The way the staff at Sunset Manor talked to us like we were children who couldn't be trusted with real information. The way they scheduled activities during the hottest part of the day. Then wondered why nobody showed up. The way they served the same rotation of bland meals week after week, dismissing complaints with smiles and promises to look into it that never led to changes. I watched my fellow residents accept it all with the resigned patience of people who'd been taught that being grateful was more important than being happy. Mrs. Patterson stopped mentioning the thin walls. Mr. Rodriguez stopped asking for help with his cough. Mrs. Chen, who'd been a professor before she came here, stopped trying to start interesting conversations during meals. We were all learning the same lesson. Don't make waves. Don't be difficult. Don't expect more than the bare minimum. Because at our age, we were lucky to get even that. I started walking the neighborhood surrounding Sunset Manor, past more that summer. Long walks around houses where real families lived real lives. I'd see children playing in yards while their mothers worked in flower gardens, fathers teaching sons to throw baseballs, teenagers washing cars in driveways, life happening the way it was supposed to happen, messy and loud and full of purpose. Sometimes I'd walk past my old neighborhood, though I tried not to make a habit of it. The house looked different now. The young couple had painted it a color Harold would have hated, torn out my rose bushes to make room for some kind of modern landscaping that looked like a magazine photo, but had no soul. They'd added a deck where my vegetable garden used to be, installed one of those above-ground pools that blocked the view of the sunset from the kitchen window. It was still a house, but it wasn't my home anymore. That belonged to strangers now, people who didn't know that the third step creaked, or that the basement flooded if you didn't keep the gutters clean, or that Harold had carved our initials in the oak tree. Out back on our 10th anniversary, one evening in August, I was walking past the elementary school where Emma and Tyler used to go, back when they were small enough to get excited about playground equipment, and simple enough to think their grandmother was interesting. I stopped at the fence and watched some kids playing on the swings, their laughter carrying across the empty playground. That's when I saw him, Tyler, my grandson, who was supposed to be 9, but looked older somehow, more serious. He was sitting alone on a bench, not playing with the other children, just staring at his phone with that blank expression kids get when they're trying to disappear into their devices. "Tyler," I called out, walking closer to the fence. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" He looked up, startled, like he'd been caught doing something wrong. Then his face went through a series of expressions I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe embarrassment, definitely something that looked like guilt. "Oh, hi, Grandma Dorothy." He glanced around like he was checking to see if anyone was watching us talk. "I'm just waiting for Mom to pick me up from practice." "What kind of practice?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going, trying to connect with this boy who used to climb into my lap and ask me to tell him stories about when his daddy was little. "Soccer," he said, but something about the way he said it didn't ring true. He was wearing regular clothes, not the grass-stained uniform I'd expect to see after soccer practice, and his hair was neat, not sweaty and disheveled from running around a field. "Where's your equipment?" I asked gently. He looked down at his phone again. "Oh, we just had a meeting today about the schedule and stuff." Tyler had always been a terrible liar, even as a toddler. He'd get that same shifty look when he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, or when he'd broken something and tried to blame it on the cat. But now he was lying to his grandmother, and we both knew it, and the weight of that knowledge settled between us like a wall neither of us knew how to climb. "Is everything okay at home?" I asked. He shrugged, that universal gesture kids use when they don't want to talk about something but can't quite bring themselves to lie outright. "Mom and Dad fight a lot," he said finally, so quietly I had to strain to hear him through the chain-link fence, about money and stuff. "And Mom says I can't tell anyone because it's family business." My heart clenched. This little boy, sitting alone on a playground, carrying secrets too heavy for his narrow shoulders, protecting adults who should have been protecting him. "Tyler," I said, leaning as close to the fence as I could get, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right? I'm your grandmother. I love you no matter what." He looked up at me then, really looked, and for a moment I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who believed his grandmother could fix anything with hugs and homemade cookies and stories about brave princes who always saved the day. "I know," he said, "but Mom says you're busy with your new life now. She says we shouldn't bother you with our problems." My new life, like living in a sterile apartment surrounded by strangers, was some kind of exciting adventure I'd chosen instead of the lonely exile it actually was. Before I could respond, before I could tell him that he could never be a bother, that his problems were my problems because that's what love means, a car pulled up to the curb, Jessica's white SUV, music thumping from the speakers, windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. Tyler jumped up like he'd been shocked. "That's my mom. I gotta go." He ran toward the car without looking back, leaving me standing at the fence with my fingers wrapped around the cold metal links, watching my grandson disappear into a vehicle that might as well have been a spaceship, for how distant and unreachable it seemed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tyler's face, about the careful way he'd spoken, like he was walking through a minefield of family secrets. I thought about Emma, too, wondering what she knew, what she was carrying, what kind of pressure she felt to keep quiet about whatever was happening in that house I'd helped them buy. The next morning, I called Marcus. Not the usual Sunday call, but an impromptu Wednesday conversation that caught him off guard. "How are the kids?" I asked, after we'd gotten through the usual pleasantries about weather and health. "They're fine," he said, but there was something tight in his voice. "Why do you ask?" "I saw Tyler yesterday at the school playground. He seemed upset about something." There was a long pause. Then Marcus sighed, and when he spoke again, he sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with getting enough sleep. "Look, Mom, things are a little stressful right now. Jessica's been taking these expensive classes, trying to become a yoga instructor, and it's not cheap. And the kids need things for school, and the house needs work, and my job isn't as secure as it used to be." I waited for him to say more, to explain why any of this meant Tyler had to sit alone on playgrounds carrying secrets. But he didn't continue. "Maybe I could help," I offered. "I have some savings left from the house sale. If you need money for the kids, or for repairs, or anything important." "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. "We don't need charity, Mom. We're handling it. It's not charity, Marcus. It's family helping family." But even as I said it, I could hear how hollow the words sounded, because we weren't family helping family. We hadn't been for a long time. We were polite strangers making careful conversation across an ever-widening gulf of misunderstanding and resentment. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but we're fine. The kids are fine. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. The universal code for nothing is fine. But I'm too proud, or too angry, or too tired to admit it." That conversation haunted me for weeks. I kept replaying Marcus's voice in my head, the way he'd shut down so quickly when I offered help, like my money was somehow tainted, or my concern was an intrusion. I started paying closer attention to the little details during our phone calls, listening for what he wasn't saying, as much as what he was. Jessica had stopped getting on the phone with me entirely. When I asked to speak with her, Marcus would make excuses. She was at yoga class, or she was helping Emma with homework, or she was dealing with something that couldn't wait. Always something that was more important than talking to her husband's mother. The kids stopped coming to the phone too. They were busy, Marcus would say. Homework and friends and activities that filled every spare moment of their lives. But I remembered being their age, remembered how much time there was for everything when you were 9 and 12. How a phone call with Grandma could easily fit into an afternoon, unless someone had taught you it was a chore to be avoided. Started keeping a journal during those weeks, writing down the dates and times Marcus called, what we talked about, how long the conversations lasted. Not because I was trying to build a case against him, but because I was starting to doubt my own memory. Was I imagining the growing distance? Was I being overly sensitive about normal family dynamics? But the numbers didn't lie. The calls were getting shorter. 3 weeks between conversations instead of 1. 15 minutes instead of 30. And the content was becoming more and more superficial. Weather and health and generic pleasantries that could have been exchanged between strangers in an elevator. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a Thursday in September, unseasonably warm for Minnesota. I'd been sitting on the small balcony outside my apartment, reading a mystery novel and trying to ignore the sound of Mrs. Patterson's television bleeding through the thin walls, when my phone rang, Marcus's name on the screen, but calling on a Thursday instead of Sunday. That was unusual enough to make my stomach clench with worry before I even answered. "Mom," he said, and his voice sounded different, strained, like he'd been practicing what he was going to say. "Marcus," I said, sitting up straighter in my plastic lawn chair. "What's wrong? Is everyone okay?" "Everyone's fine," he said quickly. "But I need to talk to you about something. About your living situation." "My living situation?" I looked around my tiny balcony, at the view of the parking lot and the dumpsters behind the building next door. "What about it?" "Well," he said, and I could hear him taking a deep breath, like he was preparing to dive underwater. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider your next steps." My next steps. Like I was following some predetermined path that he and Jessica had mapped out for me, without bothering to ask where I wanted to go. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was starting to understand all too well. "The thing is, Mom, Sunset Manor is expensive, really expensive. And with your savings from the house sale, plus Dad's pension, you're probably spending more than you're bringing in every month." He wasn't wrong about that. The monthly fees at Sunset Manor ate up most of my income, leaving very little for anything beyond basic necessities. I'd been dipping into my savings more often lately, telling myself it was just temporary, that I'd figure out how to make ends meet somehow. But I'd never mentioned any of this to Marcus, which meant he'd been monitoring my finances somehow, keeping track of my spending in ways I didn't know about. "How do you know what I'm spending?" I asked. "Mom," he said, and now his voice had that careful patience again, the tone he'd use with a child who wasn't understanding something obvious. "I'm the executor of Dad's estate. I have access to the accounts. I can see what's happening with your money." The executor of Harold's estate, something I'd agreed to years ago when Harold was sick, and we were trying to get all our affairs in order. Something I'd forgotten about in the grief and chaos that followed his death. Something that gave my son the legal right to watch every penny I spent and judge whether he approved of my choices. "I see," I said, though I didn't really see anything clearly anymore. Everything felt upside down and backwards, like I'd walked into a funhouse where all the mirrors showed me distorted versions of myself. "The point is," Marcus continued, "you can't keep living like this, spending your savings down to nothing. What happens when the money runs out?" "I don't know," I said honestly. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been taking it 1 month at a time, hoping something would change, hoping I'd figure out a solution before the problem became critical. "Well, Jessica and I have been researching options," he said. "There are places that are much more affordable than Sunset Manor. Government-subsidized housing for seniors, Medicaid facilities that provide the same services at a fraction of the cost." Medicaid facilities. I knew what those were. I'd visited friends in places like that over the years. Sterile institutions that smelled like disinfectant and resignation, where residents sat in wheelchairs, lined up along hallways, like cars in a parking garage, waiting for nothing in particular. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "those places are for people who have no other options, people who have no family, no resources, nowhere else to turn." "But that's just it, Mom," he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "You do have other options. We're your family. We want to help, but we can't keep subsidizing a lifestyle you can't afford." Subsidizing? I'd never asked him for a penny. I'd been paying my own way since Harold died, living on my own income and my own savings, making my own decisions about how to spend the money Harold and I had worked 52 years to accumulate. "I'm not asking you to subsidize anything," I said, confusion and hurt bleeding through my voice. "I pay my own bills. I take care of myself. For now," he said. "But what happens next year when the money runs out? Or the year after that? Do you expect us to step in and cover the difference? Because honestly, Mom, we can't. We have our own expenses, our own responsibilities. The kids are getting older, and college is going to cost a fortune. And Jessica's trying to build her business, and my job situation isn't as stable as it used to be. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not concern for my well-being, but concern for his wallet, fear that someday I might become a financial burden instead of just an emotional inconvenience. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I understood anything anymore. Good, he said, and he sounded relieved, like we'd just solved a problem instead of creating a dozen new ones. I'm going to send you some information about facilities that might work better for your situation, places that are more in line with your actual budget. After he hung up, I sat on that little balcony for hours, watching the sun move across the parking lot and trying to process what had just happened. My son, the boy I'd raised and supported and loved unconditionally, had essentially fired me from my own life. He'd decided that my choices were too expensive, my independence too costly, my dignity too much trouble. The packet arrived 3 days later, a manila envelope with my name written in Jessica's careful handwriting, containing brochures for what Marcus had euphemistically called more affordable options. I spread them across my kitchen table and studied each one carefully. Riverside Manor, where residents shared rooms and bathrooms and meals were served cafeteria style at preset times. Golden Years Community, which looked more like a hospital than a home, with residents in hospital gowns, shuffling through corridors under fluorescent lighting. Peaceful Valley Care Center, where the photos showed elderly people strapped into wheelchairs, staring blankly at television screens. Each brochure featured the same carefully worded descriptions of dignity and compassion and individualized care. But the photos told a different story. These were warehouses for old people, places where families deposited relatives they no longer wanted to deal with, institutions that prioritized efficiency over humanity. At the bottom of the packet was a handwritten note from Jessica, her cursive letters perfectly formed like everything else about her. Dorothy, it said, I know this is hard, but we really think this is what's best for everyone. These facilities have trained staff who can help with your medical needs as you get older, and the social aspects will be good for you too. Plus, you won't have to worry about finances anymore once you're on Medicaid. It's really a blessing in disguise. Love, Jessica. A blessing in disguise. That's what she called the systematic dismantling of my independence, the forced surrender of everything I'd worked for, the transition from autonomous human being to managed care recipient. I threw the brochures in the trash that night, but I couldn't throw away the knowledge of what my family really thought of me. I was a problem to be solved, an expense to be minimized, an inconvenience to be managed as efficiently as possible. That's when I started making plans of my own. I spent the next week researching, not the facilities Marcus and Jessica wanted me to consider, but other options they hadn't thought to include. I looked into senior apartments in different cities, places where my savings might stretch further. I investigated volunteer programs that provided housing in exchange for light work. I even looked into tiny house communities and intentional living arrangements for older adults who wanted something different from the traditional nursing home model. But every option I explored felt like another form of exile. Another way of accepting that my life was essentially over, except for the administrative details of waiting to die. Then I remembered something Harold used to say when we faced difficult decisions about the kids, or the house, or our future. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, drawing lines down the middle of the page, listing pros and cons until the right choice became clear. But Harold's approach assumed that all the choices on the table were acceptable, that the decision was just a matter of finding the least problematic option. What happened when all the choices were unacceptable? What did you do when every door led to a place you didn't want to go? That's when I realized I'd been thinking about this all wrong. I'd been looking at Marcus and Jessica's ultimatum as a problem to solve, instead of what it really was: information about who they'd become and what they valued. They valued their comfort over my dignity, their financial security over my independence, their convenience over my happiness. These weren't negotiations or discussions or family decisions made with love and concern. These were ultimatums delivered by people who saw me as a liability instead of a person. And once I understood that, once I really accepted what I was dealing with, the path forward became surprisingly clear. I wasn't going to choose between unacceptable options. I wasn't going to let other people decide what my life was worth, or where I belonged, or how I should spend my final years. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into some institutional setting because it made other people's lives easier. I was going to do something else entirely, something that would remind everyone involved that Dorothy Henderson wasn't just some old woman to be managed and manipulated and moved around like a piece of furniture nobody wanted. I was a human being with agency and intelligence and the right to make my own choices about my own life, even if those choices made other people uncomfortable, especially if those choices made other people uncomfortable. The plan started simple and grew more elaborate as I thought it through. First, I was going to visit Marcus and Jessica. Not a scheduled Sunday dinner with phone calls and coordination and careful management of expectations. Just a surprise visit from a mother and grandmother who wanted to see her family. And if they told me there wasn't room for me in their house, if they suggested I should sleep outside like some unwanted animal, then I'd do exactly that. But I'd do it in a way that made a statement nobody could ignore or dismiss or pretend they didn't understand. I was going to bring my own bed. Not just any bed, mind you. I was going to bring the bed that mattered. The bed Harold and I had shared for 37 years. The one with the carved headboard he'd found at an estate sale and restored with his own hands. The bed where we'd held our babies when they couldn't sleep, where we'd talked through every major decision of our marriage, where he'd taken his last peaceful breath 3 years ago. That bed was sitting in a storage unit across town, along with most of the furniture that wouldn't fit in my tiny apartment at Sunset Manor. I'd been paying $60 a month to keep those memories locked away in a concrete box, visiting sometimes just to touch the familiar surfaces and remember what home used to feel like. But now that bed was going to serve a different purpose. It was going to be my statement, my declaration, my refusal to disappear quietly into whatever corner they'd designated for inconvenient elderly relatives. The logistics took some planning. I couldn't exactly load a queen-size bed frame and mattress into my compact car, assuming I could even manage the lifting and loading by myself. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I asked for help from someone who had no agenda, no ulterior motives, no complicated family dynamics clouding their judgment. His name was Frank, and he worked maintenance at Sunset Manor. Frank was probably 60 himself, with calloused hands and a gentle way of speaking that reminded me of Harold. He'd been the one to fix my heater during those cold March nights, working late into the evening, because he said no one should have to sleep in the cold. Frank, I said when I found him, replacing a light bulb in the hallway outside my apartment. I need to ask you a favor, a big one. He set down his tools and gave me his full attention, something that had become rare in my experience with people these days. What do you need, Mrs. Henderson? I need to move some furniture, I said, from a storage unit to my son's house. And I need someone who won't ask too many questions about why. Frank studied my face for a moment, and I could see him taking in the determination that must have been written there. The set of my jaw that meant I'd made up my mind about something important. When do you want to do this? He asked. Saturday morning, I said. Early, before most people are awake. He nodded slowly. I've got a truck, and I've got a strong back, though it complains more than it used to. You paying for gas and breakfast after? I smiled, feeling something lighten in my chest for the first time in weeks. Deal. That night, I called Marcus, not to ask permission or explain my plans or give him a chance to talk me out of what I was about to do, just to let him know I was coming. Marcus, I said when he answered, sounding harried and distracted as usual. I'm coming to visit this weekend. This weekend? His voice carried that familiar note of inconvenience, like I'd just announced I was arriving with a contagious disease. We didn't talk about a visit. Jessica's got plans, and the kids have activities, and we're trying to get some work done on the house. I'm not asking to be entertained, I said calmly. I just want to see my family. I'll be there Saturday afternoon, Mom, he said, and I could hear him shifting into that careful management mode he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. This really isn't a good time. Maybe we could plan something for next month when things settle down. I'll be there Saturday, I repeated, around 2:00. Before he could argue further, I hung up. Let him wonder. Let him worry. Let him try to figure out what his suddenly unpredictable mother was planning. Friday night, I barely slept, not from anxiety or second thoughts, but from anticipation. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of just drifting along in the wake of other people's decisions. I felt alive again, purposeful, like the woman I used to be was waking up after a long hibernation. Frank arrived at 7 Saturday morning with his pickup truck and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. We drove to the storage unit in comfortable silence, both of us understanding that this was about more than just moving furniture. The storage unit smelled like dust and memories when I rolled up the metal door. Everything was exactly where I'd left it 6 months ago, carefully arranged and covered with sheets like I was preserving artifacts from a life that used to matter. That's a beautiful piece, Frank said when we uncovered the bed frame. Your husband make this? Restored it, I said, running my fingers along the carved headboard. Found it at an estate sale and spent 3 months bringing it back to life. He said it reminded him of the bed his grandparents had, the one he slept in when he visited them as a boy. Frank helped me load the headboard, footboard, rails, and mattress into his truck with the kind of care usually reserved for precious cargo. He didn't ask why I was moving my bed to my son's house instead of my own apartment. He didn't point out that a woman my age probably shouldn't be making sudden decisions about major furniture moves. He just helped me secure everything with rope and bungee cords, making sure nothing would shift during the drive. So there I was, at 78 years old, standing in Marcus and Jessica's perfectly manicured driveway, with my carved headboard leaning against Frank's pickup truck, and my mattress rolled up like a sleeping bag. The look on their faces when they opened the front door was worth every dollar I'd spent on storage fees for the past 6 months. Sleep in the yard, Grandma? Fine, but I brought my own bed, because I'd learned something that day that took me 78 years to figure out. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. And I was done accepting scraps of dignity from people who'd forgotten that respect isn't something you outgrow just because you get old. That night, sleeping under the stars, on Harold's restored bed, in my son's backyard, I felt more at home than I had in 3 years. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what they tell you to do, but on your own terms. Because dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you claim for yourself.